If 1968 was the year of protest, 1969 was the year of the impossible. In the 1950s, more people believed we would find a cure for cancer before we would put a man on the moon. The space race once again pitted the Soviet Union against the United States. The prize? The first to reach the moon. Successful Sputnik launches led to the first manned spaceflight. In 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first man in orbit. Shepard became the first U.S. man in space in his suborbital flight a month later. John Glenn, in his Mercury 6 capsule, then orbited the Earth in 1962. Now that manned flight had been achieved by both the United States and Russia, the new focus of the space mission was to see if man could walk in space. On March 18, 1965, the Russians sent two cosmonauts, Pavel Beyayev and Alexei Leonov, on the first mission to walk in space. 10 weeks later, the United States launched two of their own astronauts to conduct a spacewalk. Edward White climbed from the Gemini 4 and became the first American to walk in space. The Gemini program was capable of carrying two men into space. But the Apollo craft had to carry three men to the moon, towing with it a lunar module that would take two of the astronauts to the lunar surface and bring them back to the spacecraft. The resulting size of the payload, or cargo, to be boosted into space was so staggering that no rocket in use at the time could have done the job. A 36-story high missile, the Saturn V, had to be specially designed and constructed. When the brave new designs took form in hard steel, disaster struck almost immediately. Apollo 1, scheduled to lift off and orbit the Earth in January 1967, tragically burned on the launch pad during a countdown rehearsal. Astronauts Virgil Gus Grissom, Edward White, the first American to walk in space, and Roger Chaffee were asphyxiated when an electric fire broke out and spread rapidly in the capsule's pure oxygen atmosphere. Apollo 10 took three astronauts tantalizingly close to the moon, as a test of the lunar module in lunar orbit brought the craft to within 9 miles of the surface. On July 20, 1969, a Saturn booster rocket lifted off the Cape Canaveral launch pad carrying Apollo 11 and its lunar module, the LEM. On board the Apollo were Michael Collins, the pilot, Neil Armstrong, and Edwin Buzz Aldrin, who would land the LEM on the moon. The Apollo had been given the name Columbia, while the LEM was called Eagle. On July 20th, Columbia sped in orbit around the moon, while Armstrong and Aldrin entered the tiny LEM. Slowly, Eagle, the LEM, was separated from Columbia.
Eagle, Houston, we're all go.
A blast from one of its engines sent Eagle coursing down towards the moon's surface. Thrusters attached to the LEM slowed its rapid descent through the moon's airless sky. The sounds of Neil Armstrong's voice could be heard as he helped Buzz Aldrin land the LEM.
You're a go for landing, over.
The men at Mission Control waited with tense and silent anticipation. Then, Armstrong's voice broke into the silence.
100 feet, 3.5 down, 9 forward. 5%. 75. 75 feet. That's looking good, down a half. 6 forward. 60 seconds. Lights on. 6. Down 2.5. Forward. shadow. 4 forward. 4 forward, drift into the right a little. Down a half. 30 seconds forward, drift. Picking up some dust. Got the shadow out there. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Man was on the moon. Now Armstrong and Aldrin began their preparations for walking on the moon's surface.
Do you think you can open the hatch at this pressure, about 0.12 psi? We're going to try it. The hatch is coming open.
Helped by Aldrin, Armstrong backed through the hatch onto a ladder.
How am I doing? You're doing fine.
A camera mounted on the outside of the LEM began to work. On Earth, millions of people watched with awe and excitement as their television screens lit up with the image of the LEM and the ladder on the surface of the moon. After a moment, Armstrong appeared in his bulky spacesuit on the slim ladder. And then it happened.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
A human being was standing on the moon, 240,000 miles from Earth. Armstrong walked about, leaving footsteps in the fine powdery dust that coated the moon's surface. In a few moments, Armstrong was joined by Aldrin. The two men planted an American flag on the moon's soil, then began the important work of setting up instruments for experiments and collecting samples of rock to be brought back to Earth for study. Unbeknownst to the astronauts and the millions of people watching on Earth, mission control scientists were working frantically to solve a serious problem. During Eagle's descent to the moon, mission control had lost track of the craft for a short time. As a result, it wasn't known exactly where Eagle had landed. Without knowing Eagle's location, mission control could not figure out the exact amount of time Eagle's engine would have to fire in order to put the ship on the proper path to rejoin Columbia orbiting overhead. Mission control worked frantically to solve this problem. By the time Armstrong and Aldrin had completed their mission, the problem was solved.
And you're cleared for takeoff. Roger, understand. We're number 1 on the runway. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5.
The lunar module had been built so that its bottom section would become a launching platform from which the top portion, carrying the two astronauts, would take off.
Yeah, beautiful. 26, 36 feet per second up. 5 to the pitch over. Very smooth.
The Eagle took off from the moon's surface to rendezvous with Columbia. Collins, who had been orbiting the moon in Columbia, saw Eagle's blinking light coming towards him. The two vessels linked up, and once Armstrong, Aldrin, and the boxes of moon rocks had been loaded onto Columbia, Eagle was cut loose. The three men headed back to Earth. President Kennedy's pledge to reach the moon by 1970 was fulfilled 1 year early.